I'm Mark Doty. I am a trustee of the Griffin Poetry Prize. We will be hosting a wonderful event in Toronto where the shortlisted poets will be reading from their work and the winner will be announced. One of our finalists is the superb American poet, Diane Seuss. I am delighted to be talking with Diane this afternoon.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for doing this.
Certainly, certainly. It's a pleasure to be with you. Modern poetry. I want to talk about this idea of writing a book in which poetry itself is so central. Not only is it what is being made, it's one of the things that's being thought about in this book in a very marvelous and fresh way. So, did you ever, yeah, I'm wondering if you ever had people tell you, don't write poems about poetry.
Yes,
Me
that's why I
too.
did
Good.
it.
Just say more about that.
Yes, as I was coming up as a young writer, the truism was don't write poems about poetry. And I followed that. But I found myself coming up against some feelings and ideas that seemed to require that assignment to myself. And um, it asked me to defy that rule, um, partly because I was thinking back to my first class in poetry. It was called Modern Poetry at Kalamazoo College, where I was a first year student, taught by Conrad Hilberry, who was a Michigan poet, quite well known, an amazing human being who really scraped me up out of Niles, Michigan, and rescued me from the life I probably would have had otherwise, helped me go to college, etc. And modern poetry, we studied Theodore Retke, William Carlos Williams, Sylvia Plath, Gerard Manley Hopkins, and Wallace Stevens.
Phew.
And as sort of, in ways limited as those five poets were in terms of, the global possibilities of who we might consider modern, they have persisted in my imagination as pillars, really. Um, I wasn't as I say in the title poem, Modern Poetry, which is about that class, I wasn't prepared. I wasn't developmentally prepared for what I learned there, but I packed it away and it became essential as I evolved as a person. And an incident happened in that course, um, during that course in which Plath was called by many of the young men in the classroom psychotic, a nutcase, and that I was psychotic for defending her. And so really from that early, I began to see the divide, and what there would be to contend with if I was to continue along this path. So I thought back to that. Politically in this country, we were experiencing what we all know we're continuing to experience now. And the pandemic was in full force. I was very isolated. I was feeling very cynical. And I began to ask myself, this thing that I've devoted my life to, can it still mean? Can, can it still apply to what's happening in my life and in the lives of everyone around us? So I needed to make that leap and to write in defiance of the rule. And then to do so, really, I mean, poetry is what I have. I don't have a partner. I do have a dog. Um, but most of my life has been poetry. A lot of other things fell away. So why not argue with this thing that has become sort of the backbone of my existence? And then that unfolded through time as I worked to into other subjects that I cover in the book. like romantic love and objectivity and self-love, um, all of it. So that's how it happened. I hope it's okay to call a book modern poetry and have my young face splayed across the cover.
Modern poetry is also the name of the red anthology that you described. That was a textbook for your class, right? And
That's
that
right.
book and the fate of that book becomes an important image.
Yes, actually, it was the first book I ever saw in my life with the word poetry on it. My father died when I was 7. My mother had not gotten to get educated. Her parents wouldn't help. And so she went to college then after he died and became an English major and brought books into the house. And that book, this little red and white anthology, Modern Poetry, was one of the spines that I saw in her bookcase. I wasn't ready for it. I was just a little kid, but it compelled me and I never forgot it. When I was working on this book, I found it on eBay and I bought it. Yeah.
I love how, and very much connect to the way that you talk about literature, about reading as being a way of finding and claiming a self as a young person. That work is not it's not literature as entertainment. It's not merely admiring a well-made work of art. It's something about finding a space in which one can be oneself, a space of freedom, of imaginative possibility.
Yeah.
I would guess that rings true for you.
Very. Yes. It's always from the very beginning, it's been that for me. I was raised in a rural place, very working class people, my family included. And poetry wasn't sort of part of the program. It wasn't on the syllabus. But the images, the details which bloomed into images, um, that I was surrounded by in that place, are still the central images of my work. So reading was always crucial. I'm actually writing some new poems about how my mom would drive me across the state line to Notre Dame University as she drove in to where she went to school and dumped me off at the library. That no, if you've been there, it's this tall building with a mosaic of Jesus, all spreading across the sky. And I mean, I would go from floor to floor and explore the books. And somehow um, this contributed to, I guess it's another theme in the book, the self-teaching that I did my whole life, my self-education, which I know all writers do in one way or another. But there wasn't much in the sort of officialdom of my education that that gave me what I needed to ultimately write poems. And so I sought it out. I found my way places like that.
Were you writing poems then, or were you collecting what would become the language and the material of poetry?
I started writing what I called poems when I was maybe 14 years old. And all the girls in my high school were forced to take typing and home economics, which I blew. But typing I was really good at. And, it was old typewriters. And the guy who taught the class was a really short man, and he would come up behind me and see I was good. And he said, just you can do whatever you want, just type away. And so I started writing poems in there. Thank
That's
God
great.
for people like that
Yeah.
that gave permission. I didn't know there was a left-hand margin. or anything like that. So I'd go all over the place, wee with the carriage return. Um, but there was something I think in those early poems. And one of those my guidance counselor sent to a contest in Michigan, and that's where Conrad Hilberry sort of
Ah, okay.
found me. He was the
Gotcha.
judge.
How
Yeah.
wonderful. Those figures make so much difference to a kid who does not have a lot of encouragement, or who maybe has desires or interests which are sort of apart from those, featured in the culture around him or her. Yeah, that's certainly true for me too. So your argument, look, you are arguing with poetry as well as embracing it. You are clearly, grateful for this form. It is a lifesaver. It's a source of affirmation, self-blessing when one can get to that. But it's also something that doesn't do everything you wish it would do. And if you want to say anything about that argument,
Mhm.
that kind of back and forth with poetry that you go through in this book.
Yes, and actually that argument required a new kind of language for me.
Mhm,
I was always sort of an imagination poet, a poet of more hallucination, and this required a rhetorical voice
mhm,
that
mhm,
almost, in some poems, verges on the essay.
mhm.
And so I'm taking on poetry um, in terms of its efficacy in contending with the things that we're contending with now. And yet, I argue my way, I think, through the whole book to a place of in which poetry can stand. Poetry does. It doesn't do everything we wish it could do, but it does do something irreplaceable that nothing else can do. Um, I think I say in one of the poems that, through the poem, you can go up to the sheeted edge of the deathbed,
Mhm.
which is an image from when my own father was sick. Um, you can, with the poem, and I've learned that from your poems as well, Mark. Um, they had a profound impact on me as I was evolving. Um, a- and um, and that even through thinking through the frailties or the the false possibilities of language, I really did argue my way toward something that couldn't be that I was always good at arguing, like with ministers who would come to our house and uh, try to save my mother and I, from whatever. And I was good at arguing them away from the door. So, I used my powers of argumentation, but there was something I couldn't get rid of in poetry.
Mhm.
And in the last poem, a very short poem called Romantic Poet, that's about Keats. Um, a friend of mine who's a scholar said, "Oh, you would have hated him. He didn't bathe and he wiped his ass with his hand or leaves, and he was this or that." And the end of that poem, I write all of that truth, but then at the end, "But the nightingale," I said, you know. So there is something that lives past all of our arguments.
That last line, "But the nightingale." Yes.
Mhm.
So, for much of the book, you're worrying about romantic poetry or the romanticism built into, our deep regard for the world, built into the idea of love. Oh, and you wind up you kind of give romanticism a good pummeling while nonetheless absolutely loving it. It's there and desiring it, but you move in another direction finally, which I think is the gift of the rhetorical, the gift of a skill of argument, which is to stand back a bit from experience and gain another perspective. I see that especially in this remarkable poem called Gertrude Stein, a poem I just love. Would you want to read that for us? You feel like doing that?
Sure. Gertrude Stein. I just brushed the dog there on the dog's couch. I was wearing a black Well, to call it a gown is a criminal overstatement, a black rag. It became clear to me, and when I say clear, I mean the moment went crystal cathedral. I could see my life from not a long shot, but what they used to call an increment apart, a baby step to the right or left of myself, about the width of a corrective baby shoe. There I was, broad shouldered, witch shaped, without the associated magic, with my dog in my shack, once mauve faded to pink, beyond sex or reason. A numbness had set in. Gertrude Stein, Picasso's portrait of her, that above it all or within it all look on not a face, but the planes that suggest a face. The eyes aren't really lined up right, or the real eyes are peering from behind the cutout shapes of eyes. The couch had been a sort of, not a gift, but a donation of sorts from a person with plenty of money. When it was dragged into my house, it was already stately, but with worn patches and stains. A trinity of dogs over time had laid claim to it. Three egotists. To brush the dog meant I had to visit it in its monarchy. And in that visit, that single prismatic increment, I saw I'd become, maybe all arrive in their own time, some before dying, some after, a draped artifact, haystack or headstone rising out of the plains. And then, with fascination and a degree of sadness and even objectivity, I loved, as I once loved tender buttons, myself.
I think that's such a stunning example of thinking about making art as a way of standing back or gaining just that much of an increment of distance from the self to feel tenderly towards oneself, to see experience in a different light, to stand back from longing and desire, the many difficulties that press upon us, and have a kind of embrace, a very grown-up embrace of what it means to live.
Mm,
Stunning poem.
thank you. That
And
means so much to me, Mark.
and it speaks to the remaking of a self through art as well, I think. You know, that those three dogs, those three experiences that that love the speaker comes back to and then sees in a new perspective. Of course, it leads to that wonderful portrait of Gertrude Stein, who has, you know, become in that picture so much larger than any single person in a way.
Yes,
Yeah, the
that
construction.
the iconic, that she has become planes and shapes and, yeah, an icon of herself rather than just a self. One of my college professors said to me once, "Di, you're in danger of becoming an artifact." And, I thought, well, there are worse fates, but,
Absolutely.
I think he was right in a sense that to be an artifact is dangerous, but also to be able to see yourself as somehow having an impact that lasts
Mhm.
is crucial, especially if you're some kind of artist. The last poem in my previous book, Frank Sonnets, is really a poem about, does anything continue? Um, does anything of this and the legacy of kisses is what I turn to. I kiss lips that kiss lips that kiss
Mhm.
lips that
Mhm.
kiss Whitman's lips, you
Yes,
know?
right.
So I think this has been a continuous consideration for me is
Yeah. And it's interesting to think about poems as a kind of more abstract or more ephemeral example of that kiss or instance of those kisses that something is
Yes.
made. And there in your anthology of modern poetry is something that survives of Theodore Keats, something that survives of Sylvia Plath. Not the person, and not their struggles, agonies, intensities, pleasures, but an artifact made that serves as container or vessel of that life
Yes.
somehow and can communicate it.
That
Yeah,
feels, yeah,
yeah.
that feels real.
So your relationship with Keats is really interesting in this book, and the way that beautiful poem that also right towards the end of the book. I want to
Yeah,
begin.
there are 2 that are bigger poems about
Mhm.
Keats before that last one. I think it's
Right.
romantic poetry
Yes,
is
that yeah,
yeah, yeah, and I sort of, in my imagination, s sail to his death room,
the edge of the
and,
sheets. Yes.
yeah, and plant kisses all over his death mask that
Yeah.
leave my lipstick marks. And there we are together listening to the fountain outside the window for
You know,
that.
because we have this background behind us you can't see. I'm sitting in my library, and on the shelf is that death, the copy of that death map,
Mhm.
one of those plaster casts. Well,
Yeah.
so what is it? What is it about him? Can you describe what matters most in that relationship?
Yes. Well, um, I think there's a real personal hook. You know, we have these like 2 or 3 experiences that form our imaginations. One for me, obviously, is losing my dad when he was so young. He was 36. He got sick at 29, probably related to exposure to stuff in World War II. He was on a ship. And so the young dying man is has become an archetype, I guess, in my imagination. Um, and I love how Keats confronts that so honestly in his letters and in the fragmentary poem called "This Living Hand," um, where he confronts his death with fury in that poem, and give me, reader, your lifeblood so that I may live again, and you can have your conscience calmed. See, here it is, he says of his hand, I hold it toward you. And to me, there's nothing more to say about what poems do than that. And so there's that poem, um, his, the grief he felt about not having time to create a legacy. And then the poems themselves, obviously, which I learned so much from. Um, The Nightingale, that poem, the ode, especially, but others. So I connect with his struggle. I connect with his grief. And I love that he was kind of a scamp too in his earlier days, that he fell so deeply in love so quickly and had to leave her in order to try to save himself. It's all, it all lives in me, I guess.
I love the way that this living hand encapsulates so much of what Whitman was doing in trying to push his way through the page to be there face to face with the reader. I thought of you long and hard, considered you long and hard before you were ever born.
Yes.
Yeah, that intense personal connection. But you distill, in a way, you're the last line in this book, but the Nightingale is the response to everything else that is difficult, that was struggle, that tried to limit you, that stood in the way, that sort of said, is this life really worth doing? You know? And
Mhm.
that's an amazing opposition to distill Keats into that single line, but the Nightingale.
Yeah. Yeah, and his notion of negative capability, which is a great way to consider the things that make us suffer.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
And
yeah.
so he helped me with that. Lorca too. Um, yeah, I consider some of
Another
these
short life.
people personal friend. You know,
Right.
they don't know
Yeah.
me, but I know them,
Yeah.
and they teach me a lot. They're the company I keep here.
And that has much to do with what I was thinking about how we make a self out of the stuff of reading. And particularly, perhaps as a younger reader, when you find those voices uh, that offer you a place to stand, offer you something that you can believe, or seem to be holding a hand out to you. It's really
Yes, a
necessary.
living hand,
Yeah,
damn.
absolutely. Huh. What? So, are you finished writing poems that center around poetry, that are occupied with the work of poetry? Or let's say this, use poetry as a metaphor for knowing?
Hmm.
Or what's happening now?
What's happening now, I tend to do in a sort of oppositional disorder I have. I tend to do what I haven't done, especially in my last book. So after Frank and writing contemporary sonnets, I knew that I needed to go longer, to go free verse rather than in some sort of modified form. Um, and so I decided after modern poetry that I would write with music as my guiding force. So these are short, relatively short, skinny, um,
Mhm,
music driven poems. And the name of the next book is Althea,
mhm,
the name. And Althea is kind of a figure in the book that braids herself through other poems that are quite uh, sharp or piercing about contemporary life. Althea is the opposite of contemporary life in the book. Um, so I'm still working, but it appeals to the ear, I think.
would you say these are more outward looking poems?
In ways, but also I do have poems about poetry in there. I
Okay.
was just realizing that. Yeah, I do have poems, but they're a little more snarky. I'd say the snarky part of me runs deep here.
Were you always able to access that in your poetry, or was that something you had to work towards letting out on the page?
Which the snark
The
or
snarky
the
part.
yeah, oh yeah, I think
Yeah.
so. Yeah. Yeah, I did. And maybe I had, my mom was pretty snarky. So, is pretty snarky at 95. She
Mhm,
remains. Um, and um, despite everything, we laughed a hell of a lot. And so I like that intersection between hilarity and grief
mhm,
that,
mhm.
can come through in poems. And I think I've been able to access that in different um at different registers maybe in my work.
Mhm. My friend Marie House says that a goal for her is to get every aspect of her emotional life on the page. So she needs to have poems that are maybe resentful, hypercritical, stressed out, worried, you name it. That there is no feeling that should be unrepresented.
Yes.
Interesting way of unfolding a self. But I think
Isn't
for
yeah,
most
I
of us, there are
think
things we
that's
don't want to
very
show so quickly. Go ahead. Sorry.
I just said I think that's very true. I love that. And I love that we can do that without hopefully still getting, thrown in prison or something.
Or
For
unfolded.
now, we can do that.
Yeah.
And I'm so happy for Marie Howe and her
I
poetry.
know. It's
Yeah.
thrilling. Just thrilling. Yeah. For me, I always thought that poetry needed to be in some way or another redemptive. It ought to take you someplace better than where you are. And so to allow myself to be unconsolable or just utterly, despairing about something, I just could not do for the longest time. And sort of letting that in was not easy.
How about now?
Oh, it's been easier now.
Mhm. For some reason.
For some reason. Yeah. It's a little harder to get to that, shining redemptive moment.
Yes.
Yeah. And it
Well,
just presents itself now and then.
you found redemption in language and in the image, um, in a way that, I didn't have in my grasp for a while to be able to do. I've never been able to do what you do, obviously, but to be able to touch the image with that kind of reverence, I think is something that I learned from you, one of many things.
I think one of the things that you do with great power is to approach the difficult, see it for what it is, and say, and here's
Mhm.
what I can do with that. And
Yeah,
that's so true in the Gertrude Stein poem that you really for is a marvelous example of that.
I
So,
wasn't sure where this book would end up. If it would end up at some sort of negation,
mhm.
which would not be cool, but I didn't know. And so when I got to But the Nightingale, I was really happy.
But was that the last poem that you wrote for this
Uh-huh.
book? Uh-huh.
Yes.
Well, it has to be, doesn't it? Yeah,
There was nowhere else to go.
that's a very hard one ending, very hard one information. And
Thank you. Thank you.
yeah, and for having the courage to write a book which questions that which you live by. Mhm. It's clear that making art is a center for you. That's the thing that holds you up, yeah. But to
It
say
is
maybe it's not worth it, maybe it doesn't work. It's a really
that
important
was
distinction.
that was the question. I think we enter a book, writing a book with a question. And that
Yes,
was the question. And if I already knew the answer, I wouldn't write the book. So I came to my answer.
that's a
Poetry
wonderful way.
gave me the answer.
It's a marvelous way of thinking about working on a book of poems,
Mm.
and it's actually helping me just now with something I'm struggling with. So that's good.
Oh,
Thank
good.
you. Thank you
I
very much.
read your big poem that you recently posted.
Mhm.
Uh, you know what I mean.
Yeah,
Um, tell me the
yeah.
title again.
It's called it's called Immortal Diamond.
Yes, 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 yes. Amazing.
Oh, thank you.
Amazing poem.
Thank
Yeah.
you. I sort of have to work backwards from that with the rest of the book, thinking about the
Yeah,
diamond.
it's true.
It's an
It's
interesting
true.
way
How'd
to
I
do it.
get there?
Yeah,
How do
okay.
I map
Thank you so much for that.
getting
Really,
there?
you're so
Yes.
well, listen, I want to wish you the very best and encourage any listeners here to come hear you read on June the 4th, 7 p.m. Will be live streamed on YouTube from Toronto with the readings of other Griffin Prize shortlisted poets. And marvelous, Diane. What
Thank
was
you. Thank you for spending this time with me. It's been an amazing gift. Thank you.
you were a delightful speaker and so full of ideas that are fresh and bracing and very genuine. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Art.
Take care.
Take care.